We'll start by talking a bit about the difference between using React and HTML. Then we will talk about basic React concepts such as the structure of a component, functional components, and classes. And we will also talk about JSX. We will learn how to use CSS in React, events, states, and we will introduce 3 React hooks: useState, useEffect, and useContext. We will also see how to work with multiple components and how to make them communicate with each other. We will use error boundaries to prevent our application from crashing due to some error. Let's start this module by looking at an example of the difference between HTML and React. Here we are in Visual Studio Code. We are in our React application, which we created in the first module of this course. What I want to do in this video is to show you the difference between using simple HTML and using React. For that, we are going to make an example of a simple watch that will be updated once every 1 second. For that, I want you to go to the public folder and let's go to index.html, and in here, and let me minimize this, and in here, I want to come down here and I want to do the following. Below this div, I want to say div id example HTML. What I am going to do here is that I will replace this div with a clock that will get updated once a second. So let me say here script, and let me say here const example HTML equal to document get element by ID. I want to obtain this div, so let me copy its ID and let me paste it here. And now we'll say const render equal to, and I will use an arrow function here. So render is a function, and this function is going to say example HTML dot inner HTML equal to, and I will use backtick here, and then in here I will write some HTML like h3 example HTML h3. I will put an input here, and then I will say div, and here I will put, using a string interpolation, new date. What is this going to do is that this is going to display the current time. Now I want to update this every second, and for that I will use a set interval. I will say here set interval, and I will pass the render function and also 1000 milliseconds, which means that this render function will be executed once every second. Now I will save. I will go to the terminal, new terminal, and I will say npm start so that I can run my React application. And now the application is here, and if I go below, you are going to see that here we have our clock. As you can see, we have 14, 50, and 36, 37, 38. It is updating once every second. And not only that, but we have here this input. If I try to write in the input, you are going to see something really weird, and that is that the text gets automatically deleted from the input. Why is that? That is because if we go back here and let me close the console, you are going to see something. You are going to see that this render function is being invoked once every second, right? And every time the function gets invoked, the inner HTML of the example HTML gets completely replaced by this expression that we have here, which means that every single second we get a new input on the screen. But this is not okay, because what I wanted to update was only this div. That was the thing that was changing. The only thing that is changing is supposed to be the time, not the input. How can we fix this? One way of fixing this is using React. Let's see that. Let's fix the problem that we had in the previous video, which was that the UI of our clock was getting completely updated, but we only want to update that part of the clock, this div that I have here, and not this input that I have here. One solution to this is to use React. React has something that is called the virtual DOM, through which React can know what changes to do to the UI in an efficient manner, so that if what changed was this div, then only this div will be updated. The rest of the page will be left as it is. Let's see that. Let me go to the Explorer. I want to open this app.tsx file, which represents a component, specifically a functional component. We're going to talk more about functional components later, but now I just want to make this example. So what I am going to do is that I will delete all of this whole div, and I will put a div here and a div here, and in here I want to put the exact same HTML. I want to copy this and I want to paste it here. Now let me say Shift-Alt-F so that I can organize this. Now this won't work as it is. If I save and I go back to Google Chrome, you are going to see that if I press F12, we're going to see this big exception. That is because I cannot use this directly here. If I want to change something in the UI in React, I need to use something called a state. We will talk more about the state later in this module. For now, I will just do this. I will say const, I will use the structuring, and I will say my date, comma, my date update, and let me put this U in capital, equal to use state control dot, because I need to bring use state from the React module. If you look up here, you are going to see that we have use state from React, which is a function that allows us to use a state in functional components. And what I'm going to pass here is the default value of the myDate variable, which is the current date. So what we're doing here is that we are invoking the useState function, which allows us to have a state in a functional component, and this function returns us two values: a variable, which is the state, and another function which will allow me to update this variable that we have here. So I don't get to update this variable directly, but I update it through this function that we have here. So what I want to do here is to say, and let me delete all of this, in order to write a variable in the UI, in React, you have to say an expression like this. So let me say my date, and I will say to a string. Now let's see what we have. Let me save. Let's go back to Google Chrome. And now, as you can see, although we have the previous error, we can clear the console. We now have example HTML twice. We should change that. We should change this to React, save, go back here, and now we have React here. Now, as you can see, this time that we have here is not getting updated. It is showing the current time when we loaded the page, but it is not getting updated every second. So we need to fix that. For that, let me go back to Visual Studio Code, and we have to use something called an effect. An effect in React refers to a side effect that you can use in functional components or function components. For example, in our case, we want to use setInterval because we want to update this myDate variable once a second. That is considered a side effect of the component, and that is why we have to use an effect. Don't worry, we will talk more about effects in React later in the same module. For now, I just want to say here use effect control dot, because I want to bring use effect from React, as you can see here. And now here I need to pass a function, so I will pass an arrow function. And now in here I can do my side effect, which in my case is the use of setInterval. So let me say here const interval id equal to setInterval, and in here I can update this variable once a second. But if you remember, I told you before that in order to update this variable, you have to use this function. So let me do that. I will say here myDateUpdate, and here I can pass new date. And the second parameter of set interval is the time. So I will say 1000 milliseconds. And let me come here because we set set interval. That is better. And now we need to clean this interval before exiting this useEffect function. So let me say return this and clear interval ID. And that's it. Now I can save. Now I can go back to Google Chrome, and as you can see, this clock is now moving, which is great. But let's do our test, because remember that the problem with this is that the HTML example kept updating the whole UI, at least this part. But in the case of React, I can write whatever I want, and as you can see, my string, my text doesn't get deleted when I write it on this text box. Why is that? Because as I told you before, React is smart enough that it knows that the only thing that changed in our application, in our UI, was this div, and therefore that is what is getting updated. This input is being left alone because this input is not being updated. Remember that we are using our state in order to update our UI. And because of that, React knows that since we're using myDateUpdate, this means that this state is getting updated, and therefore it just updates the part of the UI that is using that state. This is something that we can also appreciate from here. I can press F12 and let me go to Elements, and if you see here, you can see that this div example HTML is getting completely updated every second. The div is changing, the H3 is changing, the input is changing, and this div is also changing, which means that everything is getting updated. But if I go to this div root, which is where our React application lives, and I expand this div, you are going to see that here only the part with the clock is getting updated, only this div. The input is not getting updated, which means that indeed React is smart enough that it knows how to update the UI in the most efficient manner possible. Now, this was kind of an advanced example because we saw a state, we saw useEffect, we saw this return, and all of that. In the next video, I am going to explain you slowly about everything that you see here and about the structure of your application. In this video, we are going to talk about the structure of a component, specifically of a function component. Here we have an example of a function component. As its name implies, a function component is a component that it is a function. Another kind of component is the class component, which we will see in the next video. For now, let's focus on this one. As you can see, here we have the UI of the component, which is what the function returns, and we also have some logic above that UI. So whenever you want to have a piece of functionality, you can put it here, and when you have a piece of UI that you want to show to the user, then you put it in this return. As you can see, we have return parentheses, and inside of it we have this div. It is not an accident that I put this div like this. I put a div, and inside of it I put all of the elements. What will happen if I delete this div? Let me delete it and let's see what happens. As you can see, from the get-go, we're getting an error, and it says JSX expressions must have one parent element. We're going to talk more about JSX later in this module, but for now, just so you know, there are some rules about what you can do here. And one of those rules is that there must be only one parent element. Here you have 3 parent elements, which is forbidden in JSX, which is why I had to put a div enclosing all of this. Now, as you can see, the error went away. Something else that I want you to look is that up here I have some imports in which I can indicate what elements from other modules I can use in my component. This component represents its own module. As you can see here, I am exporting the app function, which means that all of this is a module. This allows us to divide our application in different modules so that we can organize everything in our project. Something else that you can see up here is this import app CSS. As you can see, we can use CSS. We have this app CSS file, and because we're importing it, then it means that the CSS is going to get applied into our UI. We're going to learn several ways of working with CSS later in this module. Another thing that you can see that we have here is this app test TSX. As its name implies, app test TSX is a file which allows us to do automatic tests in React, specifically to our app component. Besides that, here we have two folders, the public and SRC. The SRC folder will contain all of our components of our application, plus CSS files and so on. In the public folder, we have different static files of our application, like a favicon, the index.html, a PNG image, a JSON file, and so on. So if you have images and static things like that, you can put them here. Let me go to the index.html because I want to comment this script out and this div also because it pertains to a previous example that we did in the past. Now you may be wondering, why are we showing the app component on the screen? How is this getting configured? This is getting configured through the index.tsx file. If we come here, you are going to see that we have this react-dom.render function that is being used. And inside of it, we have this app component, which means that through this react-dom.render function, we are rendering our app component into the screen. But how is it getting into the screen? Okay, I am saying here that I want to render the app component, but where? Well, for that you have to look at the second parameter of the render function, which is document.getElementById root. This root is located here in the index.html file. As you can see here, we have this div here, which is where our application is going to get placed. Therefore, through the index.tsx, we are saying that we want to display the app component into wherever is the root element of our index.html file. Now that we understand a little bit better the structure of a component, of a function component, I want to talk to you about class components. We will see that next. In React, we can use two styles of components, functional components and class components. Today, with respect to functionality, both styles can do more or less the same, since with the introduction of React hooks, functional components can also do some of the features that in the past were exclusive of class components. As its name implies, a functional component looks like this. As we can see, this is a functional component because it is literally a function that returns UI. And this UI looks like HTML, but it is not HTML, it is JSX, which we will talk about in a later video. The important thing about JSX is that it is a way to represent the UI in React. The name of this component is the same as the name of the function, app. Notice that we declare the component with their first letter capitalized. It is the standard in React that components start their name with a capital letter. That is, that they use KML notation. Previously, these functional components tended to be quite simple. They could not have special functionalities, such as allowing us to clean resources, use a state, among other things. We will talk about state later, but basically it is what allows us to update the UI depending on the update of variables. However, as we said, React hooks already allows us to do all of this and more. So there is a lot we can do with functional components. So much so that it is no longer mandatory to use class components in almost any scenario. class components are another way to declare components. This is the syntax of a class component. As we can see, we have a class which inherits from React component, and within this class we must declare a render method which will return the UI of the component. In this case, we are also using JSX. As I mentioned before, in the past only class components could use state, execute a function when loading the component, executing a function before destroying the component, etc. But this all changed with React hooks. So now you can choose between functional components and class components, and the decision is more of a matter of taste than a matter of necessity. Despite the introduction of React hooks, class components can be used now and in the future without problems, since the React team has said that they will continue to be supported. Let's look at some class and functional components side by side, just so you can see the difference. Do not worry, although you may not understand the code of these examples, that is because there are topics that I have not explained to you just yet, and we're going to cover those topics later. The idea is simply for you to see the difference between both styles of components. If you want to work with parameters in components, you can do the following. In the case of the function component, we can pass the parameters of the component through the parameter of the function. Meanwhile, in the case of the class component, you can use this.props.something in order to access the parameter sent to the component. If you want to work with a state in a function component, you can use the useState React hook, and you can update the state by using this function that we have here. In the case of a class component, we have to use this .state in order to declare the state, and then we have to use this .setState in order to update the state. Executing functions at the beginning and end of a component's life cycle. The idea of this scenario is that you can execute a function at the beginning of the life cycle of a component and also before a component is destroyed. In the case of a function component or functional component, we can use useEffect for side effects, and also we can use it to run a function at the beginning of the life cycle of a component, and also that return that we have here inside of the useEffect will run just before the component is destroyed. This is ideal for cleaning up resources. In the case of the class component, we have several methods like component.mount, which allows us to run a function at the beginning of the life cycle of the component, and component will unmount for running a function just before a component is destroyed. As you can see, there are differences between the ways of doing things in functional components and class components. However, both can do almost the same. In this course, we are going to concentrate on using functional components, since with the introduction of React hooks, they have become kind of mainstream. This does not mean that class components are bad or anything like that. You can continue to use them in your professional life if you prefer. I'm only saying that in this course, we will use functional components. In this video, we are going to make a new component so that we can start from scratch. This component, this app component, is a little bit complicated with all of this stuff that we have here. So what I want to do is to create a new component. So let's go to SRC here in the Explorer, right click, new file, and I will call this component simple.tsx, enter. And in this simple component, we're going to have a simple UI. So first I want to say function simple, and then I will return, and here I can return whatever I want. I can say h1 hello world, and then you know that this is a functional component because it is a function and it is returning UI, specifically JSX, which we will talk about in the next video. Now we have to export this. There are two ways of doing that. We can say export default simple, which is the name of our function, or we can delete this from here and say export default function simple, and it is the same. You can do it whichever way you like. I prefer this one. So let me save, and now I have to go to the index.tsx component because I want to put here my simple component. So I will say simple here. And now I need to import the simple component. For that I can come up here and say import simple from simple, semicolon here. And now I can save and I can go to Google Chrome. And as you can see, we have Hello World here, which is a rather simple UI, a rather simple component, but it is good because now we don't have too many things on the way. Let me close others so that we can concentrate on this. So as you can see from this simple component, we are returning this piece of UI which gets rendered on the screen. You may notice that we are not using a parenthesis here like in the past. In the past we had parentheses here and here, and what the parenthesis does is that it allows us to have multiple lines of UI in a single return. So for example, I can put a div here. Remember that we can only have one parent here in JSX. Now I can have more HTML elements here. For example, this is a subtext, and I will save, and now this UI will be on the screen right here. Now, I keep mentioning JSX, JSX, JSX. Let's see what's that about.